The rope did not look like much, just old leather, twisted and knotted around a wooden pole, lashed to the yoke of a farmer's cart. But no one standing in that courtyard was breathing normally. Alexander stood in front of it, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes tracing the coils the way a man searches a face for an old scar. Behind him, generals, soldiers, priests from the temple, some of them quietly hoping he would fail. Because for 100 years, kings and princes and clever men had come to this exact spot and tried to do what he was about to try. And every single one of them had walked away with empty hands. This is the story of the knot no one could untie. And the man who decided the rules didn't apply to him. It began long before Alexander was born, in a village called Gordium, in the hills of what is now central Turkey. A poor farmer named Gordius once drove his ox cart into that village at the exact moment the local priests were searching for a sign. An oracle had told them their next king would arrive in a wagon. Gordius arrived in a wagon, so they made him king. Grateful, or maybe a little afraid of losing whatever luck had just found him, Gordius dedicated that same ox cart to Zeus. He tied it to a post inside the temple, using a knot wound so tightly, so impossibly looped back on itself, that no one could find where it began or where it ended. Then came the prophecy that made it famous. Whoever untied the Gordian knot, the oracle said, was destined to rule all of Asia. For generations, the cart just sat there, a rope, a dare, tied in leather, gathering dust in a temple courtyard. Kings tried. Princes tried. Strong men wrapped their whole bodies around it and pulled until their knuckles went white. Patient men sat cross-legged in front of it for hours, tracing every loop with a fingertip, hunting for the one strand that would unravel all the rest. None of them ever found it, because there wasn't one to find. By the year 333 BC, the knot had settled into something like a local legend everyone had quietly agreed to stop taking seriously. A curiosity for travelers passing through. A story you told a visiting stranger over dinner, half as a joke. Then a 23-year-old king marched into Gordium with an army at his back and asked to see it for himself. Alexander had already taken most of Asia Minor. City after city had opened its gates rather than face his cavalry. He was young. He was fast. And everywhere he went, soldiers on both sides were starting to whisper a new word about him. Invincible. But whispers do not win wars forever. Armies get tired. Supply lines run thin. Somewhere in the back of every commander's mind sat the same quiet question. How far can this actually go? So when Alexander heard about a rope that supposedly crowned the ruler of an entire continent, he didn't wave it off as superstition. He walked straight to the temple. The courtyard went quiet as he approached the cart. Up close, the knot was worse than the stories described. Layer over layer of cornel bark rope, twisted so tightly the fibers had fused together, with no loose end visible anywhere along its length. Alexander crouched beside it. He turned the yoke slowly in his hands, running his fingers over the braid, searching for an opening the same way every failed king before him had searched. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Was he stuck, the same as all the others? Or was he simply making sure before he did what he had already decided to do? Because Alexander had not walked into that temple to outpatience a piece of rope. He rose to his feet. He drew his sword. And in front of his own men, in front of the priests of Zeus, in front of 2 centuries of failed kings, he brought the blade down and cut straight through the knot in a single stroke. The leather fell away in severed pieces. The yoke clattered onto the temple floor. For a moment, nobody moved. Had he just solved the world's most famous puzzle? Or broken it? Some of the priests were horrified. This wasn't untying, and everyone standing in that courtyard knew it. A few of them said so, quietly, to one another, already imagining how the gods might take offense. Alexander didn't argue the point. He didn't need to. He bent down, picked up the two severed ends of rope, and held them up for the whole courtyard to see. A loosened knot, he told them, was a loosened knot. Nobody had ever said how it had to come undone. Then he walked out of the temple and went back to conquering Asia. Here is the part of the story that made it travel. It worked. Not the trick with the sword itself. The idea behind it. Within a decade, Alexander had done exactly what the oracle promised on that cart 200 years earlier. He crossed into Persia. He defeated Darius III, not once, but twice. He pushed his army further east than any Greek force had ever marched, all the way into India, and built an empire stretching from the Balkans to the Himalayas. The largest the ancient world had ever seen. Did the sword stroke in that temple cause any of it? Of course not. Empires are not won by cutting rope. But something about that single moment in Gordium clung to him like a second name. Long after his death, when historians sat down to explain who Alexander really was and how his mind worked, they kept coming back to that same courtyard. The cart, the knot, and the fact that when everyone else in history had tried to solve it, the way it was supposed to be solved, he simply refused. Strip away the swords and the empire, and what actually happened in that courtyard was much smaller than it looks. A man was handed a problem. The problem came with an assumed set of rules. Untie it. Don't cut it. That nobody had ever actually written down. They were simply understood, passed from failed king to failed king, like an inherited habit. And Alexander is the one person in 200 years who stopped to ask a question nobody else had bothered to ask. Who said these were the rules? The ancient historian Arrian, writing centuries later from earlier sources, recorded the knot story as part of a much larger portrait of Alexander's character. A leader defined again and again by his refusal to accept a situation as fixed, simply because everyone around him treated it that way. Arrian wasn't trying to teach a lesson about rope. He was documenting a pattern that showed up on battlefields, in sieges, in politics, over and over across Alexander's short life. That pattern has a name today, and it didn't come from a historian. It came from a psychologist named Carl Dunker, who spent his career studying exactly why smart people get stuck on simple problems. Dunker's research described something he called functional fixedness, the tendency to see an object or a situation or a rule only in the one form it was first presented to you and to become blind to any other way it could be used or understood. Give someone a box of tacks and ask them to attach a candle to a wall, and most people struggle because they see the box only as a container. The moment they realize the box itself can be the solution, the whole problem dissolves in seconds. The Gordian Knot was a 200-year-old box of tacks. Every man before Alexander stared at the rope and asked only one question. How do I undo this? Not one of them stepped back far enough to ask the question underneath it. What actually counts as solving this? That gap between the problem as it's handed to you and the problem as it actually is where almost everyone gets stuck. Not because they lack the strength or the patience. The strong men in that courtyard had plenty of both. They got stuck because they never questioned the shape of the puzzle itself. Think about how often this plays out far away from any temple, a process at work that everyone follows because that's how it's always been done, long after the original reason for it has disappeared. A family tradition nobody actually enjoys anymore, kept alive out of obligation rather than choice. A goal you've been chasing inside boundaries you never actually agreed to. The right job, the right timeline, the right way to get there, boundaries somebody else drew that you simply inherited and never once questioned. Most people faced with a knot like that do exactly what the failed kings did. They pull harder. They get more patient. They assume the difficulty is in the tangle, when the real difficulty is in the rule they've quietly agreed to follow without ever noticing they agreed to it. Alexander's cut through the rope wasn't really about cleverness. It was about permission. The permission he gave himself to solve the problem on his own terms, instead of the terms it arrived with. That single moment didn't build his empire, but it's a near-perfect snapshot of the mind that did. A mind that kept finding the one move nobody else thought they were allowed to make. The next time you find yourself pulling at the same knot for the 10th time, with the same strategy that failed the first 9, it might be worth asking Alexander's question instead. Not, how do I untie this? But who decided it had to be untied at all? The moral of the story is, sometimes the only thing standing between you and the answer is a rule nobody ever actually made you follow.